Turn your Bibles to Luke 22. Luke 22. And I'd like to read verses 31 and 32. Luke 22, verses 31 and 32. Jesus is speaking to Peter here. He says, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when once you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." Now, if you go up to verse 24, they had been discussing who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom that Jesus was going to establish. And Jesus had to correct them on that. He said, the Gentiles act that way. But that's not so among you. You are my friends. You're the ones who reclined at my table. You stood by me in trials in verse 28. And you will eat at my table in the kingdom, and you will sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. You have a special place in my kingdom when it comes. But then this very unusual thing happens here. He turns to Peter and he warns him here. Simon, Simon, getting his attention, Satan has asked permission to sift you like wheat. I don't know about you, but that would scare me to death. From the Lord especially, because he knows what he's talking about. If you said it, I'd say, well, maybe you don't know what you're talking about, but the Lord knows what he's talking about. Satan had asked Jesus to sift Peter. He wanted to take Peter and he wanted to throw him in the air and see what happened. Either he would land on his feet and be blown away by the wind. That's a scary proposition, isn't it? Because Peter, in that moment, when it did happen, and we know it did happen because he denied the Lord 3 times, but he eventually landed on his feet, didn't he? Satan did sift him by throwing him in the air. I don't know the man. I don't know the man. Cursed and swore, I don't know the man. But he did come back, didn't he? He landed on his feet. I've used this illustration before, and I think it's, again, appropriate to this morning. And a story I'm going to tell you. And I'm going to be a little selfish this morning to try to get a point across. And we all have stories in our lives, right, of being sifted. We all have stories of being knocked down, if you will. But I think it's true that sometimes in our life we have to be knocked down before we can be lifted up. Just kind of think about that for a moment. That sometimes we've got to be knocked down in order to be lifted up. I'm going to be a little selfish this morning, Danny. I'm going to talk about myself because that's all I know about. You know about your life. You know about what's happened in your life. I'm just going to use myself as an example. Old preacher once said you shouldn't use yourself as an example. And I said, well, I don't know. But let me tell you a story. My father and I did not have the best of relationships. My father was a hard man. He was a demanding man. He was the type of man you had to do it his way, period. It had to be done his way. Now, I'm not saying my father didn't love me. Now, I'm not saying my father didn't provide for me or my brothers and sisters and put a roof over our heads and clothes on our backs. But he was a very demanding man. And I was kind of afraid of him. I was scared of him when I was little, young man. He wasn't abusive or anything. He just yelled a lot, And so he was a man who, as some of you know, kind of drank on occasion. He'd drink on the weekends, maybe a couple weekends a month. He'd drink beer, get a little soused. But he wasn't an alcoholic or anything. He just liked to drink every once in a while on a weekend. And one thing unusual about my dad, he was a happy drunk. He'd always get happy when he was drunk. He was most mellow when he was a little tipsy, if you will. But anyway, we didn't have the best of relationships. We were five of us, and there were basically two different families, the three older ones and two younger ones, and me and Jason were the younger ones, kind of two different families. And I got him when he was a little older. But when I look back on my father, I look back more with pity now than anything else, because I understand now that he didn't know how to be a father, that he didn't have a good example as a father. You see, his father was an alcoholic, and he died of alcoholism. And all those kids grew up poor in the Depression. My dad would talk about eating so much cabbage he couldn't stand it during the Depression. They didn't starve to death, but they didn't have much money either. And it got to such a point with my grandfather. I never knew him because he died in 1944, but it got to such a point with my grandfather that my grandmother had to kick him out of the house. And that was it. And if you can imagine my father as a 12-year-old boy walking down the streets of Glasgow, Kentucky, and his father walking right beside him and never acknowledging that he existed. That can really scar a young man, can't it? That can really scar a young man. And he became bitter. And you could see that anger in him. He became bitter over the years. And so our relationship wasn't exactly the best in the world. I knew he loved me. But one day when I was about a young man, 18, 19, 20, we had a big blow up, a big one. And I'm not proud of it. But we told each other things that we just said what we needed to say, if you know what I mean. And it was so strange that after that blow up, in the midst of it, towards the end of it, he said to me, "You know that I love you." Which kind of struck me, because that was only one of 3 times that he ever told me he loved me in his life. That time, he told me once when he was soused, "I love you, I love you." And he told me on his deathbed that he loved me. And so that relationship changed from that time forward. It changed. It was okay. But again, my dad, he's my dad. Some of you know that bunch, those boys. Dad, Clayton, Clint, you know those boys. And so Dad was later on diagnosed with cancer in 1990, towards the end of 1995. He was diagnosed with cancer. And I remember the day that I was up at the house, Mom was up there, and he told us that he had been diagnosed with cancer. Stomach cancer, liver cancer. And so I left the house. And I walked down the field, middle of the field, and I kneeled down and prayed to God that he would heal my father. I don't know why I did it. We didn't have the best relationship in the world. I don't know, it just felt like I needed to do it. And from that point on, nearly every day, I prayed that God would heal my father. Nearly every day, I prayed. He tried treatments, he tried chemotherapy, different things, and the chemo was killing him faster than the cancer. So he decided, I'm not having any more treatments, I'm just going to live it out. And so, in 1997, and In June of 1997, he died. He died. And I was angry. You know why I was angry? Because God didn't heal him. I was angry with God. And so, about a month after his passing, I'm sitting there at the house with Mom. I told Mom, I said, I don't understand. God didn't heal him. He didn't heal him. I prayed and I prayed, and the Lord didn't heal him. And my mom, you know my mom. All of you know my mom, know my mom. She looked at me and she said, and you know what I've been praying? I've been praying that something to be used that would make your father turn to Christ and become a Christian. Because a year prior, he had obeyed the gospel. You see, my dad never darkened the door of a church building except for a wedding, maybe, or a funeral. But that cancer got his attention. And he was baptized at Fairview Church by my brother Jason. And I remember coming back to church here. Don Stedham was here at the time. And Dad came to church, and he sat right back there with Mom. It was glorious. He sat in church service worship. And I remember what Brother Don Stedham said. He said, I want us to welcome our brother Harlan Peden to church today. I remember that, what he said. But my mother told me, as I was sitting there after a month after he died, she said, I've been praying that something happen, something be used to make him come to Christ. And the Lord used that cancer to bring him to Christ. And I realized at that point, that my prayers of him being healed was counter to my mom's. That the Lord actually answered my mom's prayer in that. And I realized at that point that sometimes you got to be knocked down to be lifted up. And God used that cancer to knock my dad down so he could be lifted up. Does that make sense? He used it. And I'm thankful because he's saved. Right? That's the main thing. Didn't darken the door of a church building. He used the cancer to heal my father's soul. You all have a story in your life about being knocked down. About something that's happened in your life that's tested your very soul, right? That's tested you to your core, the core of your faith. But in those instances that are unpleasant, that are even sad, that will just make you question everything, God can take that situation and turn it into something glorious. He sure can. If we would let him. That's the key, isn't it? If we would let him turn it into something glorious. God doesn't give up on you. You give up on God. And when Jesus told Peter, Satan's going to sift you like wheat, But I like what he said in verse 32. I've prayed for you. There's the prayer, right? I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And once you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. In other words, he told him, Satan's going to sift you like wheat. You're going to fail. That's what he said. You're going to fall. You're going to be knocked down. You're going to be tossed in the air. But I prayed for you that your faith remains strong, and when you get through it, and when you're done, you're stronger for it, and then you can turn to your brothers and strengthen them. That's the lesson, isn't it? That's the lesson. We got people in here facing their own sifting. We got people in here facing their own dirt bath, if you will, being knocked down. But I know from personal experience and other things too, and you do too, that no matter what happens, what Satan does to us, in the most dire of circumstances, even to the point of our very life, knocking us to our knees both physically and spiritually, that God can lift us up out of that. And that we would be better for it. Now that I look back at my father's death, I can see the blessings. I can now see clearly the good that came out of that. Because it turned other men too, didn't it? Turned other men as well. It saved his soul, did it not? And it helped me to grow in faith and my family. So remember, sometimes we've got to be knocked down in order to be lifted up. And when we're lifted up, praise God for seeing you through. That's all I got to say this morning. Take that for what it is. We've all been sifted. We've all been knocked down. If there's anyone here this morning that feels that way, let us help you and support you in that. If you need to come forward as you stand and sing this song. Unprepared.